What are some of the outcomes of individuals that are in the news finds me category?
Not only can the news finds me perception over time cultivate less interest in politics and less knowledge and less political engagement, it can also perhaps lead you to only pay attention to like-minded political information and sources.
Welcome to the show. Thank you for taking part in this immersive listening experience. A meaningful existence is a moving target that, no matter how close, will always be out of reach. We hope this message finds you with an outstretched hand. As we attempt to uncover complex truths, remember, life's toughest questions can be answered if we all just focus on one thing: being good people.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Good People episode 40. Today, I was joined by Dr. Chris Skurka. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Film Production and Media Studies at Penn State University. In today's episode, our conversation revolved around his work on news exposure and specifically a group that is classified as News Finds Me. If you guys are watching on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our weekly uploads. Any interaction with our channel really does help us out a ton, and we appreciate you. Enjoy the show. Alrighty, Dr. Chris Skurka, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Tell us a little bit about what it is that you do and what it is that your area of expertise and study is.
Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor at Penn State University. I'm housed in the Department of Media Studies in the Donald P. Bellisario College of Communications. And so my expertise, and this is how I put it to folks, is that I study the psychology of media effects. So I'm trained in the field of communication. So it's a bit all over the place in terms of how people study communication. For some people, it's more qualitative. For some people, it's more quantitative. I take a very quantitative approach, drawing from basically social psychological methods and theories to understand how media messages influence people. And there's sort of two lines of my research. One is on the more applied side, one's on the more theoretical side. The applied side of my research is that my expertise is the effects of media messages about health and environmental issues. So for a long time, I studied anti-tobacco messaging, think anti-smoking campaign commercials that you see during TV breaks. I also study environmental communication. So how can we best message about climate change to get people to care about climate change? So that's sort of one line of research that I do. And then the other somewhat more burgeoning area of work I'm doing is on questions of media exposure. So a lot of the work in that first camp of research I do sort of assumes that people are exposed to media messages. You're exposed to the anti-smoking campaign message. You're exposed to news stories about climate change. But what a lot of work in that space kind of forgets is that we live in this modern media landscape where we can pick and choose the content that we come across. So we can keep scrolling if a news story is boring to us, or we can change the channel very easily. And so the work I do in that second line of research is more about selective exposure. So thinking about people being very active and picking and choosing the content that they pay attention to, and also questions of repeated exposure. How do messages about environmental topics or health topics, for example, influence our emotions, attitudes, and behaviors when we're repeatedly being exposed to that content? Might that result in message fatigue, or might that result in greater persuasion for health or environmental outcomes? And so it's really in that second camp of work on exposure, and specifically selective exposure, that this project comes into play. This project I just published on selective exposure as it relates to the news finds me perception.
This is the exposure side. Obviously, both things are very important, but the exposure side is something that I'm super fascinated with, just in the sense of, growing up, everybody always was like, be careful where you get your media from. My mom would always say, don't watch Fox News. And my grandpa would always say, don't watch CNN. And it was kind of this like conflicting thing.
Huh.
And, you just take their word for what it was. But then when you sit down and think about it, it's like, yeah, exposure to news is obviously a very important, probably the most defining characteristic of the thoughts and feelings that you have towards specific issues. Because if you're only getting a certain perspective from whatever side, that's where you're getting your information from. That is what you'll believe, or what will reinforce to a certain degree. And so I'm curious for you, when did you first become interested in news and media exposure and researching it?
So I'm a bit newer to news research in a formal way. News has always been kind of in the background of the work I do. A lot of the work I was doing in grad school was more about persuasive messaging. So almost more social marketing, more advertising. And then I got to Penn State, where I am housed in a department of media studies, where a lot of folks in my department are interested in media, not just in persuasive media, but news media, entertainment media. And so I got to connect with my colleague, Omero Gildazuniga, and he is a political communication researcher with expertise at the intersection of digital media, democracy, and civic life. And so we kind of put our brains together and we're thinking about, okay, you're interested in news and this idea of the news finds me, and I'm interested in questions about media selective exposure. Well, how can we identify a point of overlap? And I hadn't, to be honest, heard much about this idea of the news finds me perception until he put it on my radar, because my training was in a sort of different corner of the field. And I was so fascinated by it. So yes, news had kind of been in the back burner in some of the work I was doing, but once Omero and I formally began to collaborate, it was when I decided, oh, let me study this news, these questions of news more formally.
What is news finds me, and how do you sort of define that?
The news finds me perception. It's kind of a mentality that some people have where they feel like they don't have to actively seek out news because it will just come to you. It will find you through your friends, through your general social media use, and you can stay up to date about current affairs and politics that way. And it's probably something that's always been with us. I'm sure if you were to take a time machine back to the 1960s or 70s when there were only a handful of channels on, I'm sure that some people inadvertently felt like they could just rely on water cooler conversations or party conversations to learn about news. But with the rise of digital media and social media, the news are ambient. It's everywhere. You can open any social media platform at any given time of day and be inundated with news content, for better or maybe for worse. And so really social media has probably heightened this sense over time that you can just take a very passive stance to news, that news will find you in terms of, I don't have to actively seek it out, number one. Two, I can just rely on the people and social media use that I engage in. And three, that I can stay up to date that way. That's kind of the news finds me mentality.
That's really interesting you say that, because when I stumbled upon your work, and I was fascinated in a similar sense where it's something that I've never really given thought to before, I assumed that the basis of this model was almost the inverse, that because of social media, we have adopted this news will find me stance. But it's just interesting to hear you say that it seems like this could be a mentality that precedes the internet and social media, which that also makes sense to me as well, you know. And now the question that I guess that is coming up in my head is, I wonder if social media, like obviously we probably all have access to more information now, good or bad information, who's to say? But I wonder what the difference between that is in terms of before people had social access to social media versus now. If the essentially if we took a survey, would the numbers of people that fall within this category essentially be the same?
It's a good question. It's an empirical question. And honestly, I don't know if we have data from half a century ago that can really tell us that the news finds me perception has risen in prevalence over time. And I've actually kind of looked into this very casually. So political science researchers have for many, many decades been collecting national election survey polls. And I was trying to dig in there to see if they had any survey questions from the 60s, 70s, or 80s that might get at the news finds me mentality. I wasn't able to find anything. So we don't know for sure empirically with data that the news finds me perception has risen over time. But I do think you're right. I think that social media's boom in the last 15 years or so has really accelerated the prevalence of the news finds me perception because like I said, there were a handful of channels to choose from when it came to news, and you could only get your news at certain times of day when the newspaper came out. Now you open your social media feed and the news doesn't stop, and neither does your X feed, formerly known as Twitter, or your Instagram feed. And so I do think that you're right that the proliferation of social media and the way that social media have become so embedded in our lives has probably given rise to this mentality of, oh yeah, I don't have to actively seek out news because throughout my day, I'll just stumble across news content. And I do think with the news finds me perception, people who hold that perception, they probably have good intentions. Like I want to stay up to date. They are interested in staying informed about what's going on in the world and with politics, but it's a much more passive way of getting news. And from pretty much all of the research that's been done on the news finds me perception, there aren't really any upsides. It's more so downsides when it comes to predicting problematic outcomes over time.
Yeah, that doesn't really surprise me at all. Are there any characteristics that you've been able to outline of individuals that fall within this news finds me category? Is it age, gender, etc.?
Yeah, so there is some research that tells us what the sort of typical profile is for someone who believes the news will find me. And this is not ironclad. It's not like if you fall into this category, you're doomed. These are just correlations. The biggest demographic factor is age, as you mentioned. So not surprisingly, younger people are much more likely to think the news will find them than older folks are. And that's just adults. Pretty much all of the data we have is with US adults or adults outside the US. So we can't really speak to kids. But think about your typical 20-year-old. You're probably in college. You're probably focused on dating and socializing and maybe thinking about getting a job. Your priorities are not focused on what's going on in the world. You're probably more focused on finding who you are and focusing on your social life. So not surprisingly, younger adults tend to be much more likely to think the news will find them than our older folks. Probably developmental to some degree. Like I'm thinking about myself anecdotally. I'm in my early mid 30s and I'm much more attentive to news now than I was 10 years ago when I was getting out of college because I just didn't care that much. So age really is one of the biggest demographics that is associated with the news finds me perception. Gender does seem to have a relationship with the news finds me perception, not as large of a difference as age, but there is a trend such that women are more likely to think the news will find them as opposed to men. There's also some differences based on income, education. So folks who are higher income, have higher degrees of educational attainment, tend to be less likely to think the news will find them, presumably because they're more literate when it comes to making sense of what's going on in the world around them. And then we can also think about more politically oriented psychographics. So political interest. If you're interested in politics, you're probably paying close attention to news. You're less likely to think the news will come to you. Same thing for political knowledge. If you're pretty knowledgeable about politics, you're not super likely to think that the news will find you. So really, it's those demographics and psychographics that associate with that perception.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. And I'm curious, you mentioned there's pretty much only drawbacks. What are some of the outcomes of individuals that are in the news finds me category?
The research has really focused on a couple of key outcomes. And basically, what these research studies do is you measure people's perceptions that the news will find them at a given time point. And then you follow up with them maybe a couple of weeks or a couple of months down the road, and you ask them about their interest in politics, their knowledge about politics, their cynicism about political life, their voting behavior, their political engagement, to see if the news finds me perception over time predicts greater um, sort of problematic outcomes. And the research has shown that the more you think the news will find you, that over time leads you to be less knowledgeable about politics, less interested in politics, to be more skeptical or cynical about politics. And those outcomes in turn are linked to lower political engagement in terms of voting behavior. And there's also a newer paper that came out that linked NFM, the news finds me perception, to greater homophily over time. And by homophily, I mean basically filter bubbles, like saying that you tend to pay attention to news and information that aligns with your views, to only pay attention to sources who share your political perspective. So not only can the news finds me perception over time cultivate less interest in politics and less knowledge and less political engagement, it can also perhaps lead you to only pay attention to like-minded political information and sources.
Hmm. That's very interesting. Obviously that probably has a host of its own issues, right? And I guess so. I talked to this lady. Her name was Linda Hancock. She was a family nurse practitioner in her career, and now she helps educate young people on various aspects of physical and mental health. And we were talking about substance use for young people, and she was giving me some of the data on it, and pretty much suggesting that these are problems that we have to overcome, but it's also important to recognize that the majority of people use substances, whether it's drugs or alcohol, in I don't necessarily want to say a healthy way, but in a way that is non-problematic. Not
Moderately.
everybody's a binge drinker every time that they have alcohol. Some people just enjoy a glass of wine with dinner occasionally, right? And so what that kind of makes me think of is, I guess it's because of the whole like social media bubble thing. To me, this seems like a big problem. Like I for one can self-admit that at times I fall within this category, for all the exact reasons that you're talking about. I'm 23. I have a career that is uncertain. I'm trying to, make my way through this world, figure out who I am. I'm planning a wedding, all of these other things that I'm in a time in my life where I'm beginning to see that policy and politics are very important and do have a pretty big impact on your day-to-day life, whether you realize it or not. And it's important to engage with politics in a way that makes you more informed. But being on social media, I see that everybody's like that, right? Where it seems like a lot of people, or the majority of people, aren't engaging in a productive way. And so I guess my question is, what are the actual statistics on that? Are you aware of the amount of people that are actually engaging with news or with politics in a way that is productive? Are the vast majority of people within this category? What does that look like?
Hmm. So I can talk about this in terms of statistics on news use and then statistics on the prevalence of the news finds me perception. So we know that roughly, I think this is some Pew Research data, that roughly half of US adults rely on social media for news at least sometimes. So basically, 1 in every 2 US adults is using social media as sources for news content. And I think, can you be very active in using social media for news use? Yes. So maybe if you're on X, formerly Twitter, you follow reputable news sources, and some people turn to X for that very reason. When social media platforms were first introduced, it was really about life updates, like sharing how your day is going and your opinion on the latest movie that you saw. And that still happens, but in many ways, social media platforms have become a venue for sharing updates about public affairs and politics. So where was I going with this? So you can cultivate and curate a very politically oriented news feed so that your diet is largely news based. I think the research hasn't done a good job differentiating that kind of social media diet versus, oh, the algorithm will just randomly recommend me a news story because someone who I'm friends with shared this news story. I think there are different ways to engage with social media, use news. And like I said, I think the research has been a bit muddy in how it approaches. It's been kind of crude, just asking about generally how much do you use social media for news. So I think there are ways to be more purposeful and deliberate with the news content that comes across your social media feed. But again, overall, it seems like people who tend to rely on social media for news use tend to be not learning as much about politics as opposed to people who rely on more mainstream news outlets, not gleaned through social media. So that's kind of the news use aspect of your question. And as for stats on the news finds me perception, the latest survey I'm aware of that shed light on the question suggested that about 1 in 3 US adults would be categorized as having the news finds me perception, just over 1 in 3. So like you were saying with your example about substance use, it's not like most people are engaging in abusive behaviors when it comes to alcohol or drugs. Most people are actively engaging with news in a meaningful way. One question I have, and this is a question that the research hasn't grappled with yet, is how much is the news finds me a stable trait that sort of persists over time, or to what extent is it more variable? Like maybe you go through a phase where for a week you're really stressed and yes, you let the news find you, but then by and large in other weeks you're a very active news consumer, because so much of the research has been very cross-sectional. We get a snapshot of where do you stand right now with your orientation to news. And so one thing I would like to do down the road is a more longitudinal study with the same group of people and follow them over time to see, well, how stable is this news finds me perception?
That is very interesting. I'm curious about that too. And just anecdotally, as somebody who I would say that I would fall into this category with like a presidential election coming up, I have found myself being more engaged purposefully with it, to the point where like I'll see an article and about a candidate or a policy that they plan on implementing, and then I will I'll start to scroll, and then a little bit of guilt takes over and I'm like, no, I need to be well informed, and then I'll go back and I'll read through it. And I think that probably also has something to do with it as well.
Sure, current affairs pop up that you find interesting or relevant, and that sort of spikes your interest in closely following the news. And I think that's great. I think the challenge is, how do we keep people interested in political matters even when it's not a presidential election? So midterm election turnout tends to be a lot lower than presidential election turnouts are, and so the question is, how can we maintain that interest? And I do this too. Like there are some days, some weeks where I'm stressed about work or personal matters, and I let the news come to me because I just can't bother to scroll with it. And I think the important thing to keep in mind when thinking about this research is, I I don't think anyone's advocating that we be constant vigilant news consumers at all times. I don't know if that's good for people's health. The news that we come across in general is very negative. It's often very upsetting, thinking about various political events happening in the world. And so that can be taxing emotionally and for your well being. And so I think there's a way to stay up to date and informed, but within boundaries and parameters. And one thing I like about being in my college, Bellisario College at Penn State, is that we have a news literacy initiative where they've been really pushing for people to be more cognizant, but also careful news consumers when it comes to being self-protective, like finding the balance between staying active and closely following the news, but not so much that it interferes with the rest of your life.
Yeah, I see. And something you mentioned earlier that kind of struck a curiosity chord within me is this idea of curating your feed essentially to give you news sources that are maybe more credible or more diverse as to what you are exposing yourself to. And I can draw a comparison with my industry. So I'm a fitness coach. I work at a CrossFit gym, and I work a lot with coaches development and in helping our coaches have resources to continue their education. Cause I mean, I think that's probably true of anything, you have to continue to learn and develop yourself with whatever field you choose, but especially so when it comes to exercise, because, exercise science is always sort of on a new frontier of what is being uncovered within it. But anyways, I find that a lot of people that I deal with essentially it's the same exact phenomenon, like news finds me or information finds me. And some of the coaches that I work with literally follow people on Instagram or whatever social media platform is their preferred method, and they just use that as the way to teach themselves about exercise. And what ends up happening is you have a very incomplete understanding of physiology and how your body responds to stress and how your body adapts to exercise. And it's as simple as like 5 tips on a back squat. Oh, I like that. I'm going to implement this next time I teach somebody how to back squat, or whatever the case may be. And so something that I encourage them to do is, yeah, use these resources on social media. But what you have to do is essentially follow them to the main source. Essentially, I'll use a specific example. There's this guy named Aaron Horsage. His online profile is Squat University. He's a physical therapist, puts out tons of great content on strength training. But the real value of following him for me is seeing something he posts and then going to his blog post and then reading this article that he wrote where he goes over pretty much every single thing that every single characteristic of the post that he made in more specific detail, right? And now this is a great way to sort of let that news or information come to me, but then I have a little bit of due diligence to actually go figure out where it was from, read all the way through it, understand it, apply it to my current knowledge, maybe discard some of the stuff that I didn't think was very applicable to my clientele or whatever the case may be. And so have you given any thought to that? Do you think that would be a valid strategy of almost trying to curate your feed to be news sources that you know to be relatively credible, and then making sure that you do your due diligence and go to the main source?
I think you raised some really important points. One is that, yes, we can curate our social media feed so that we're getting content from credible news sources or from people we like or accounts that post interesting content, but we don't have 100% control over the content that ends up on our feed. It's like, yes, you can increase the chances that you're going to get political content, but the algorithm's going to do what the algorithm does. And so you have some control, but only within a certain parameter. And so at the end of the day, you've got to be very careful and vigilant about the information you're coming across. And so I do think that you're right, that when you're coming across information online about news or any kind of claim, really, that it's really on us before we take that piece of information or claim at face value, that we try to verify the information. And sometimes there's like a news headline that gives you the exact takeaway, and if you parrot that, you're probably getting it right. But so rarely do people actually follow up, especially if it's a claim coming from a source that's got unknown credibility. So it might seem legitimate, but you don't know. In that case, the onus really is on you to see if other sources make that claim, whether it's about nutrition or fitness or politics, which is why I think misinformation tends to take hold so easily is because people see a claim and we have this tendency, I think it's called the truth default effect. I'm probably botching it, but it's something to that effect where we have a sort of innate tendency to accept things as true. It's just a way we go about the world that we don't have the mental capacity or time to suss out every single claim that we come across in our lives, online or offline. So we just give people the benefit of the doubt, like, oh, this is true. And then it gets reposted, or you tell your coworker about it, or you have a conversation with it over dinner. And so if possible, especially when it's a really important claim for your life, whether it's about nutrition or about what's going on in Gaza, for example, that you follow up to make sure that that information is legitimate. And by legitimate, I think one way you can verify that is by looking for that claim in other credible outlets. So if you can't find other respected sources talking about that piece of information making that claim, then you probably should be skeptical about it. But again, as you point out, it's like people don't really do that much. They tend to just take it at face value and go about their day because you can't afford to. That's the challenge.
Are there any specific characteristics to the kind of news that you'd come across if you were to fall within this category? News will find me. Like, is it dependent on platform? Are there any other variables that contribute to only certain types of news are being exposed to people in this category?
It's a good question. I'm not sure we have great evidence on what exactly the typical social media feed looks like for someone who falls in this news finds me category. I do think that study I mentioned earlier, the one that showed that the news finds me perception cultivates greater interest in like-minded information and sources over time, I think that kind of answers your question, where if you're more likely to think the news will find you, you're probably following sources and paying attention to information that aligns with your views about the world. So presumably news finds me folks are paying attention and curating their feeds to get less balanced information compared to folks who would score lower on the news finds me perception, who might be less likely to just follow like-minded sources, to just click on information that supports their prior views. That's probably what I would surmise.
Mm. And I understand too, your most recent project, you also looked at the interests essentially of the individuals too, like the kinds of things that they are looking into topic wise, right?
Yeah, so the news finds me perception has really been geared toward political news. So when you measure the news finds me perception, it's basically a set of survey questions, and we ask people to indicate how much they agree with statements like, I can just rely on my peers to stay informed about news. And it's kind of vague as to what news means, and people can interpret news in different ways. Some of the survey questions to measure the news finds me perception are about just public affairs. I can stay informed about public affairs by following people online. Well, what does public affairs mean, or current affairs mean? And so one thing that we wanted to drill down on is different news genres. So obviously the news finds me perception is geared toward political news, but we also know that there may be other news genres where maybe you're not paying attention to news in that genre because it's not that interesting to you. So not only might we think about people feeling passively toward news in general, there might be specific news genres where you're like, yeah, I pay attention closely to news about the economy, but maybe not so about science. Maybe science news finds you, but maybe politics news not so much because you're very interested in politics. But science, environmental issues, maybe not so much. And so what we looked at is not just, does political news find you, and how does that map onto your news consumption behaviors, but science news. And that largely comes from my own interests in environmental issues and science issues and that other line of work I do. So it was sort of a way to sort of, again, combine my interests in science and media exposure with this research on the news finds me perception. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm also curious about how interest plays into all of this in terms of like almost willingness to engage with those news sources. I guess to call back what I brought up earlier of like, there seems to be within this category, right? I don't know if you have the data on this, but uh, not only is there this perception that's like the news will come to me, but then there's also this action that needs to take place or it takes place at some point where the new, you stumble across a news article and then you click it and you actually become a little bit more informed with it as well. And so does the interest of the individual, so to use your point, if somebody gets a lot of like science based news on their political feed versus somebody, or on their social media feed versus somebody who gets political news on their social media feed, does that change somebody's willingness to engage with that piece of content?
Hmm. So the study that we published, I think, is going to answer your question. Let me back up and explain what we did in this study. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the research focuses on, okay, this news finds me perception predicting democratic consequences over time, like political knowledge or interests or voting behavior. But what the research really hasn't done is looked at those in the moment encounters that people have with news. In other words, if you think the news will find you, does that mean you're actually less likely to click on and read hard news content? Are you more likely to pay attention to soft news content? So, soft news being entertainment, sports, leisure, not hard political or current affairs news. And so, what we wanted to do was see if the news finds me perception predicts people's actual news selection behavior. So we did this tightly controlled online study where we, in an initial wave of data collection, measured people's news finds me perceptions. We measured their interest in politics, their interest in science. We measured their political knowledge and their general social media use, all these other factors that might matter. And then we followed up with them a week or two later, and we had them browse a mock news website. So we created what looked like an AP News website that featured a bunch of different news stories, some about politics, some about COVID-19, because these data were about 2 years old when COVID was really prominent. Some stories were about science, so climate, technology updates, and then we had some soft news stories, so about sports or entertainment. And we wanted to see if this news finds me perception predicts whether you actually click on soft news and avoid hard news. Controlling for, that is, statistically taking into account and neutralizing people's pre-existing interest in the topic, their political knowledge, their political leaning, et cetera, et cetera. And what we find is that the most consistent predictor, in fact, the only predictor of people's actual clicking behavior and how much time they spend on soft news, is the news finds me perception. It wasn't political interest. It wasn't political knowledge. It really was the news finds me perception. So the more you think the news will find you, the more likely you were to click on and spend time with soft news, which is a problem because we want people to actually engage with real news content. And if you're paying attention to soft news content at the expense of hard news content, well, that's an issue. And so, getting to your question about how does political interest matter or interest in science matter, we found that those interests, which we controlled for, didn't matter as much for people's news selection behaviors as the news finds me did, which really suggests there's something going on with this perception that really seems to be playing a role in how people engage with the news content in front of them.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. And what I'm taking away from this conversation the most, I think, is that if you feel like news will find you, it won't. You have to sort of go out and look for the things that not that was I was misspeaking there. You not look for the things that you want to hear, but like you need to go out and search for things to get information, to be well informed, et cetera. And so I think, moving from this conversation, that's something that I'll definitely try to apply, and hopefully people listening and hearing you go over this will try to apply is that being well informed is something that you have to want to do, or at least know you have to do it. If you want to be well informed, you have to look for it.
Sure. And that's one of the takeaways that we offer in making sense of our findings, is that the answer is not just giving people more political news content or science news content, because clearly giving more news content could just overwhelm people. And at the end of the day, if you have this mentality that the news is going to come to you, you're just probably not going to engage with that content. And so one thing that we're thinking about now is, well, how do we overcome this? How do we reduce the influence of the news finds me perception? Can we neutralize its influence? And so we're thinking about a couple of different, I guess you might call them intervention strategies, to try to offset the news finds me's role. And one thing that we're trying is, well, what if you just tell people what their news finds me score is? So this is pretty common in social psychological research. When you're trying to manipulate people's moods, you have them do some kind of a bogus test, and then you give them a bogus answer, like, you scored in the lower 50% of our participants, you're an idiot. And of course that puts people in a bad mood. And we're not going to deceive people. We're going to be honest and say, hey, you filled out this survey, and based on everyone else's responses, you score in the upper quartile of the news finds me perception. That means that you're probably not actively seeking out news. You're probably letting it come to you, and that has all these problematic consequences over time. Might that telling people about their news finds me score reduce the negative effects of the news finds me perception on, for example, their political learning, when you give them a political news story to choose from? I think there are risks to that kind of approach. Like, you might inadvertently upset people. Like, no one wants to be told that they're doing something that is socially undesirable. So I think the question is, how might we do that in a way that isn't upsetting to people? So again, this is just us trying to dip our toe into a more interventionist approach of what can we do about reducing the potential consequences of the news finds me perception. And the other approach, I think that's a more backdoor approach, would be, well, how can we just foster people's interest in political issues? Like, how can we just get people to care more? How can we get them to recognize that what happens in politics affects their lives? And maybe the answer is not just national politics, but local politics. So much of media coverage and public discourse tends to be about what happens in Congress, in the White House. And obviously those political decisions matter, but what really matters is what's going on in your local community, what's going on in your state. So maybe the backdoor inroads to getting people interested in politics and dampen their news finds me mentality is to try to increase people's inherent interest in political matters.
Yeah, all that is very interesting to me. And my initial reaction is to bring up the comment earlier where you said age was correlated with this in some capacity. I would even say too, it might not just be age, but just from my own personal experience, I think the longer that you live, the more you realize that the state of affairs and the political climate does affect your life. And you know, obviously we are living sort of in a very polarizing time in that regard. So there's lots of talk about that. You know, right-leaning people are saying, you know, we need to have Donald Trump back because the livelihood, you know, gas was lower, et cetera, all those things. And it comes from both sides, right? But I think that probably has a lot to do with it too. Like educating people or showing people that it is true that your decision and your willingness to vote and the people that we elect do have an impact on our day-to-day lives. Maybe not immediately right now or tomorrow after they get elected, but over the next couple of years that they are in office, implementing changes and trying to have their policies get a foothold.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think age at the end of the day is probably just a proxy for people's recognition that politics affects their lives. And the older you get, the more you recognize, wow, all of this really does matter. And you realize you have more of a vested interest in staying up to date about what's going on in the world around you. And there was something else I was going to say. Mm, oh no, it's leaving me. Um, I don't. Oh gosh, it'll come back to me in 4 minutes.
Yeah, well,
Um,
something that I also wanted to add too was your comment about local community stuff. And that's something that I think, even outside of policy and politics, if you get more invested in your local community, you'll feel so much better about yourself, and you'll feel like you have a place in this world, you have a thing to work on and improve, and you'll have friends and people to share it with. And that's something we've talked a lot about on the show, is the need to find a community or a tribe or a group or a culture to get invested in, because it's not only good for everybody else, but it's also good for your mental health to do stuff for other people.
yeah, totally. And really build that sense of efficacy that what I do matters for political life. So not just does do political decisions and policymakers' decisions affect me, but how do my actions and how does my involvement in the political process matter for political life? I think it goes both ways. And political science research has shown that the more efficacious you feel, the more you feel like your voice makes a makes a difference in politics, excuse me, the more likely you are to be politically engaged. And it's not just voting, it's also civic life. So going to town hall meetings, maybe it's engaging in activism about an issue that you care about. I think that's the tricky part, is how do we build that sense of efficacy? We can try to tell people, yes, your voice matters, but I think people are most likely to believe that they have a sense of efficacy when they've actually engaged in some kind of meaningful political or civic participation themselves. I think you're right. Like my boyfriend, he lives in Philadelphia, and he one election season or two election seasons was a poll worker in his neighborhood. And it just gave him such a boost to feel like he was a meaningful member of society, to feel like he was keeping our political system running. And it got me thinking, like, I really should do that too. Why don't I do that?
Yeah, that's cool. And something that I'm curious about too is, maybe you've looked at this, maybe you haven't. I know we talked earlier about this might have been a mindset that preceded the internet. You know, you're not sure, but what do you feel like the long term implications of having high participation in this news finds me category? What do you think that the long term implications of that are?
Hmm. It's a good question. And again, I don't want to get too ahead of my skis in terms of what the data can tell us. I can offer ideas. I think so. What the data can tell us is what happens in a relatively short time frame of a couple months. And like I said, the more you think the news will find you, the more disengaged you are in terms of your political interest and lower knowledge. And I think the big question for me is, how does this matter for echo chambers and political media bubbles that we all live in? There's actually a decent amount of evidence that political bubbles online aren't really a thing, not as much as people think they are. But if members of our society continually take this this worldview where they feel like they don't have to actively seek out news and they can just be passive news consumers, well, what does that mean for the people who get elected? Because democracy's proper functioning requires its citizens to be informed about what's going on, to vote for people who are in their best interests, and best represent who they are. And I worry about people becoming so disengaged and relying on information that's filtered through comments online, that gets watered down through the telephone game, that people end up having a misguided view of what's going on in the world, about who these candidates are for political office, and then maybe even supporting candidates that do not represent who they are, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on politically. It's like democracy works best when citizens care and are invested and are informed. And so I think the real question down the road is, how can we get people to stay up to date and stay literate so that democracy works as it's intended to work?
Hmm. Are there any, you know, maybe credible news sources, things that you feel like would be good for people listening to check out if they would like to be more well informed? Maybe, middle of the aisle perspectives, fun and engaging channels or news sources that maybe are a little bit easier to interact with than others. I'm curious if there's almost a list that you have in your head of what people could check out.
Yeah, one resource I would recommend to people is the All Sides Media Bias chart. Are you familiar with this by chance?
I'm not. What is it?
All Sides is a website that basically has raters go through various news outlets and rate the sort of political slant of different news that they put out. And they've had various iterations of this chart, but basically it identifies in a sort of visual infographic where different news outlets fall. Are they very center politically? Do they lean slightly more liberal or slightly more conservative, or very liberal, very conservative? Um, and I think an important point for me is that just because an outlet has a political slant doesn't necessarily make it bad or low quality news. I think if you're at the extreme ends, yes, it can, because you can still have a bit of a slant and still have credible, legitimate news process where journalistic processes are happening to produce that news content. But if you're looking for very centrist news coverage, the best bets are going to be what they identify as what's kind of in the middle of the road. So I think AP News is probably going to be your best bet for high quality, very centrist news coverage. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick, because I don't want to give you outlets that I'm mixing up. So they list BBC, they list AP News, they list. Where did you go? Oh, here it is. BBC News, the Christian Science Monitor. Oh, interestingly, they categorize AP as slightly left-leaning, although I think most people would agree that given AP's centrality to news, that it's a very trustworthy source. Reuters, The Hill, Wall Street Journal. So those are going to be pretty credible news sources that I think people can rely on. And I think the important thing too is, and I mentioned this earlier, is just to double check. So if you're reading a news story that makes a really big claim, before you go out and pronounce it to the world, make sure other credible outlets are talking about it as well.
Yeah, I would just like to echo what you said, where you said, it's okay for obviously slight leanings one way or another on a specific issue. And I think it's silly for people to not feel that way, because they lean one way or another themselves on specific issues. And like you said, as long as people go into it with this intention of, I'm here to obtain specific information, even though it might have a lens on it from a specific perspective, I think everybody understands that is the case. And everything that you read, whether it's political news or science news or information on whatever it is that you're trying to research, like, take all of it with a grain of salt. You need to take in every piece of information that you get, and it goes through your filter, and you discard most of it and you keep what is important. And so I think I just wanted to echo that. It's okay that we have these sources that lean one way or another, because people are involved with them. Usually lots of people are involved with them. And so in some aspect, whatever you're reading is probably being filtered through multiple different kinds of lenses before it actually gets to the final product of whatever you're reading.
Totally. We're humans. We're basically just monkeys with smartphones on a rock flying through space. Like, we have animalistic tendencies to just rely on our own biases. And as much as we say we eliminate our biases, we keep our own viewpoints in check, it's impossible to do that. Like no one can truly be neutral. And news processes are in place to guard against the most obvious influences of those unconscious and conscious biases. But yes, I think take what you see with a grain of salt. One thing I like about All Sides, that's allsides.com, is that they also will give you a given news event and they'll give you an example of, here's an example headline from a left-leaning source, here's an example headline about that topic from a right-leaning source, and then a more centrist coverage of that political event. So you can see that the same political event can be framed and talked about in slightly different ways, and you can basically get a sense of what is the common denominator and in what ways might these different outlets be applying different lenses, and come to your own informed decision about what's going on.
Very good. Have you heard of the podcast Breaking Points?
I've heard about it, but I haven't listened.
Okay, I am not the person to talk to you about this. My fiance listens to it a lot. She's she was a communications major, also studied political science to some degree, and has a bit more of a vested interest in the political climate and the happenings of the world. And it's something that I know she listens to a lot. Basically, the premise that I know, I haven't listened to the show a ton. I've listened to it a little bit with her in the car and things like that. But the two co-hosts that run the show, I don't remember their names, but one of them is a little bit more right-leaning and one of them is a little bit more left-leaning. And they essentially have an hour to 2 hour long podcast conversations about specific events, and they give their own personal take. They talk about what different news articles are saying, but at least the episodes that I've listened to, as somebody who doesn't particularly enjoy reading about all of this stuff myself, sometimes I find it can be a bit easier to essentially listen to two people who their objective is to inform others in an unbiased way about what is happening. It's a little bit easier to listen to other people talk about it or present information in a way that is more neutral or more accessible, or even I find them explaining the perspective of each side to be helpful, where instead of it's like this is the way that this should be viewed, it's like this is the way the left views it, this is the way the right views it, and it's sort of take it how you want. And so instead of pretending again like those lenses don't exist, they are almost leaning into them a little bit more. Like, these are the events that happened and this is how everybody's looking at it. Take it how you want. And I think that is also a pretty effective way to consume news. Again, I'm not as well informed to speak on that as maybe I could be, but I know that my fiance has a lot of, or she enjoys listening to that show for that reason.
And hopefully it's a very civil conversation, that they're very respectful of one another's opinions, because I feel like we need more of that civil discussion in public discourse, because there's been a real rise in what's called partisan animosity or affective hostility, where over time people just have such a negative emotional response toward members of the opposite political party, such that people no longer want to engage in civil conversation. It just becomes strawmans, and it becomes talking past each other and not to one another and listening to one another. And I hope we see more representations of that, because so much of the news content we get is driving anger, because at the end of the day, a lot of these news outlets, especially those that have a very clear slant, do produce content that is going to make people mad and is going to get people riled up, because anger is what gets reshares. Anger is what gets eyeballs on the screen, especially cable news. We're talking about cable news. It's very much profit driven, and what's going to drive profit will people getting angry. And what doesn't get people angry is civil discussions between folks on the left and folks on the right. So hopefully we can get more exemplars like that in media representation, and also just don't be afraid to have a conversation with someone across the aisle from you, regardless of what your opinion is. don't expect to change someone's mind. I think it's important to go in with an open mind yourself. Um, Anyone who is so firmly planted in their own views that they cannot be swayed is probably engaging in a fool's errand. And what kind of world would we live in if we thought we were always right 100% of the time? So yeah, I hope that people at their next holiday event don't feel afraid to talk to their uncle in a meaningful, civil way if their uncle disagrees with them politically.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. I think that's an important thing to mention, as well. It just reminded me of, I think, a common thing people say in regards to a romantic relationship is just remember when you are arguing with a significant other, it's not you versus them, it's you and them versus the problem. And I think that politics are the same. If you're talking to anybody about anything, even if they're in the total opposite seat as you, and you are further the farthest from each other that you could be, you guys are both still in some way trying to work on or fix the same problem. It's just you may look at that solution in a very different way.
Totally. And having a conversation about that. Like we both have the same values. Um, find common ground. That's like negotiation tactic number one is what is the common ground? Do you have a common goal? And maybe the goal isn't to change the other person's mind. Maybe the goal is just to have an open conversation and be open to hearing another person's perspective.
Hmm. Well, very good. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
Oh gosh, I feel like we covered a lot, but yeah, I think I just want to go back to that point about finding a news diet that works for you. For me, I like podcasts, and so there are some great news podcasts that are very to the point and efficient and are not going to take up your whole day. So for me, I like Up First from NPR. It's a 15-minute roughly segment every day, and they cover the top three news stories that you should probably know about. I like that. There are plenty of other daily news podcasts, and it's a good way to stay up to date about the latest events, but keeping it confined. I think the problem is if you let news bleed into your life, especially for me, going to bed at night, I need to start winding down. I need to not be watching uh, dark dramas. I need to be avoiding heavy news stories and just relaxing a little bit. So maybe for you, it's like you wake up and look at the news, or you do it over lunch, and that's your daily news consumption. Figure out what works for you to find that healthy balance between staying informed but also protecting your emotional well-being.
Yeah, cool. Again, Linda Hancock, the lady who I just had on, she gave us this cool perspective where I think she said she heard it from somebody else, but she always uses the analogy that life is like wearing pairs of shoes. Maybe you try a personal trainer, or in this case, maybe you try consuming news first thing in the morning, and then that stresses you out, or you try it over lunch, or you try it before bed. Uh, they're all just different types of shoes that you have to try on, and one of them fits better than the other. And so I think that's a very good, interesting way to end is with that. The way you consume your news is just like everything else. There's probably a better time and a better place, and you just need to figure out what works for you.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to keep trying on shoes.
That's right.
Find
Well,
what
thank you
works.
so much for doing this. This is a little bit of a different conversation than we've done before, and I'm very glad that we've had it. I hope to continue to have more like this. I know that I'm leaving it more well informed, and I think everybody listening will too.
I'm glad to hear it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this week's episode of Good People. If you guys are watching on YouTube, before you head out, please like, comment, and subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our weekly uploads. If while you're listening you enjoyed it, please share it with someone you love, perhaps your grandma. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.